This week on Inside Olympia, Microsoft Vice Chair and President Brad Smith. What is his prescription for the state's housing crisis? What does he think of the so-called millionaire's tax? How does he think the state legislature should regulate the development of AI data centers? That and much more when he joins us for the full hour.
From the TVW studio, it's Inside Olympia with host Austin Jenkins.
Welcome to Inside Olympia. Microsoft is Washington's third largest employer. And while it's a company with an international footprint, its leaders have strong views about public policy decisions made here in Olympia. My guest this week has been sharing those views in recent meetings with lawmakers and the governor on issues like housing, taxes, and data centers. Joining me now, and for the full hour this week, is Microsoft Vice Chair and President Brad Smith. Welcome back to the program. It's been a while.
It has been a while. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for doing this. Before we begin, just a little bit of background on you and the company. As Vice Chair and President, Smith leads the company's legal, policy, and external affairs and serves as the company's principal public voice on technology governance. He joined the company in 1993 and has spent decades shaping Microsoft's approach to government oversight, competition policy, as well as privacy, cybersecurity, and infrastructure regulation. In 2021, he published the book Tools and Weapons: The Promise and the Peril of the Digital Age. And here's some background on the company. Microsoft turned 50 last year. With more than 50,000 employees, it is Washington's third largest employer. In 2025, its revenue was nearly $282 billion, up 15% from the previous year. Microsoft is in the business of cloud computing, operating systems, software, video games, and, of course, artificial intelligence, which includes its high-profile partnership with OpenAI. So let's just begin with what brings you down to Olympia. I noted this is an international company, but you are not an infrequent visitor to Olympia. You're here this week, or at least today, talking with the governor, talking with lawmakers. What's your message?
Well, first of all, I try to come every year when the legislature is in session. And in recent years, I think it's been even more important. I think last year I was here 3 times. I think fundamentally it's an opportunity to talk about where we see the economy going, an opportunity to connect on the issues of the day. This year, the issues, I think, in part involve affordability, in part technology, as you mentioned, in part issues of taxation, and provide information about where we stand. Always do this with the broader business community, especially the Washington Roundtable, which really speaks for all of us.
So what you sort of have this affordability umbrella. Within that, help us understand the key issues that you're thinking about, that the company is thinking about, and sort of where the nexus is.
Well, the really interesting thing right now is, I think first is most people are recognizing affordability, or the cost of living, is probably the single most important political issue across the United States in a midterm election year. It's something that we are very closely connected with, not only in Washington state, but nationally as we look to the midterm elections, but also in 20 different communities in 10 states where we have data centers, because that is so important. And that includes Quincy and Grant County here. As we take stock, we listen to people, meet with them, look at polling, we see really 5 distinct affordability issues. Really, housing is number 1. Number 2, in many places, is the cost of health care. Number 3 is often grocery prices, child care, and the like. Number 4 is electricity. Number 5 is education. And we have a direct connection, either impacting or having an opportunity to try to improve 3 of those 5. Housing is number 1. Electricity is number 2. Education is number 3. And they were definitely part of the conversation I've been having here in Olympia.
And I want to come back to each of those issues. When you were meeting with the governor and meeting with legislators this week, the other big topic, of course, is taxes and this proposal for a so-called millionaire's tax, a form of an income tax. You've been critical of tax policy in this state. This proposal has been getting a lot of attention, and the governor has endorsed it, with the caveat that he wants to see the revenues from this, if it actually goes into effect and it survives a court challenge, being used to reduce taxes in other ways and to, for instance, increase funding for the Working Families Tax Credit. What was your message to the governor and legislators around this particular tax proposal?
Well, I think we're all actively engaged in the conversation, following it closely. The Washington Roundtable has spoken for us, and it's something that we're studying and continuing to address. I would say two things just by way of introduction. One is just the question of if one tax is going to go up, are other taxes going to go down? Is this tax going to be constructed in a way that is sensitive to the needs of stakeholders across the economy? That's different from endorsing it or opposing it. We're not doing either of those things, but we're engaged in that conversation. The second thing I would say is, there's an adage in business that, culture eats strategy for breakfast. I think that this issue and this year are very important for the political culture of Washington State. For the quarter of a century that I've really led Microsoft's work in this area, for most of that time, I would say that we've had a very constructive political culture here in Olympia and across the state, where the business community and organized labor and nonprofit leaders and political leaders from both parties never agree on everything, but do have a good, constructive dialogue. And I feel, in all honesty, that the last year or two has put that under pressure. But I'm encouraged by this week and this year, because I think this year, say in contrast to last year in Olympia, people are trying to talk with each other, to each other, they're listening to each other, they're looking for solutions to problems. And I think as we come out of this session, it's really important to come out in ways that whatever happens on an income tax, it adds to our ability to work through hard problems together. As a company, we see this, and we see it set apart the states that are, say, succeeding from those that are not. I have a huge appreciation for the Democratic and Republican leaders in the legislature, because I think the conversation is the right one, and we'll all find out where it can lead us.
This sort of mantra about taxing the rich or making wealthier Washingtonians pay more of their fair share, do you believe that if Washington goes down this road, that will hurt business, hurt recruitment, be an incentive for people to leave the state?
First, I would start by saying we should sort of take a picture in our minds of where the state will be depending on what happens this year. Already, Washington is tied for the fourth place in the country with Oregon for the highest marginal rate on capital gains, number 4 at 9.9%. If the proposal that was introduced this week is passed, we will become tied for number 5 for the highest marginal rate for personal income tax overall, again tied with Oregon. And then last year, because of what was passed, we are number 1 all by ourselves for excise tax. So let's just first, I think, recognize that whereas the decade began with people saying we have a very regressive tax system, wealthier individuals don't pay enough, we are likely to enter the second half of this decade with a very different situation. Then you start to think about the economic impact of this. The biggest concern I've had in the last year, frankly, has nothing to do with the impact on Microsoft. It's the impact of the estate tax increase last year, because I do think it has led and is leading people to change their planning about where they want to spend their later years in life. Now go back to that picture, if you will. Look at the other states in the top 5. California and New Jersey are 2 of the top 5 for capital gains and income tax. Their estate tax is 0. New York, for example, is high. Oregon is high. They're in the top 5 for capital gains and personal income, but their estate tax is 16. So the first thing I think that should cause us to conclude is, look, we can't afford as a state to be like leading the way in every high tax category. So I think it's a very constructive step that this week has seen not just the introduction of a new bill on personal income, but legislation that would reverse what I think was the clear error last year of raising the estate tax. Let's send the people of Washington State a message. This isn't just about taxing one tax after another, increasing one tax after another. We are going to, even if we increase some taxes, going to decrease some others. We'll start to see a balance, and we'll start to focus on budget sustainability and accountability more broadly. In other words, we do ourselves the best, I think, if we broaden the aperture and start to think about more pieces and how they might fit together.
You struck kind of an optimistic or more optimistic tone about this year and the potential for parties that don't always see eye to eye still kind of conversing and maybe getting to somewhere where, I don't know if it's compromise or at least where everybody's speaking. Last year, you had pretty strong words. In I guess it was about a year ago at this time. You said, "I have frankly never been more worried about the future of the tech sector in Washington State as I am today." Why did you say that then, and do you still feel that?
I think there's two separate issues. They connect, but we should probably tease them apart. One is the impact of state policy on the tech sector and just investment in the state and growth in jobs. And the second is just call it the economic transformation of the tech sector.
Yeah.
So let's talk about the policy
side,
dynamic first. Let me, I think, remind us all of something that no one is thinking about. We're going to have an exciting day. This is on people's mind on March 28th. For the first time in history, there are going to be passengers taking a train across a floating bridge. We will have done something that no one else has ever done.
This is when that light rail
the light
opens
rail
up.
goes across the I-90
yep.
bridge. That's a great day. We're going to celebrate it, and we should. But we should also remember two things. That day is going to come to us, not just because of great work by people who have literally built it, but because it went on the ballot 5 times. 3 times to ask the public to support it. Twice we had to beat back initiatives that tried to undo it. We succeeded. And we succeeded not just because of strong political leadership, but because the business community and organized labor were always there. We showed up, we raised money, we spent money, we used our voice, we encouraged our members, if they were unions, or our employees, if we were companies, to stand up to make this possible. And in my years here, 30 years now having lived here, great things always require that combination. Not just for that, but say the 520 bridge, the viaduct, the other steps we've taken across the state. That's why I say that political culture matters. I'm more optimistic this year than last year because I felt that last year everybody was just focusing on what might divide us. Now there is at least a conversation about what connects us. And the more we can build on that, the better we will be for everything that's going to come as we look ahead.
I want to pivot to some of these issues that you highlighted a moment ago, including housing. But just one last question. What would you say has been your main message as you go from meeting to meeting to meeting, whether that's with the governor, legislative leaders, the revenue folks? What's the takeaway message? And what would you be saying to lawmakers who you didn't get to meet with?
Well, I would say 2 things. First, let's remember affordability. It's the number one issue. And there's a lot of opportunities to do good things, especially, I would say, around housing and around education. Number 2, when it comes to taxes, let's not just argue about whether there will be a tax, but how it's constructed. And let's construct it so that we advance budget sustainability. Let's construct it so that we build accountability and deliver more results. Let's construct it so that we reduce the business taxes that I think are hurting economic growth in the state. Let's construct it so we're very careful with respect to charitable deductions because that will have such a huge impact on the nonprofit sector, and that is so critical for our state.
Well, let's move on to housing because that is obviously a crucial affordability issue. It's also something that Microsoft has recently put forth something of a white paper on, and has previously teamed with Amazon to put quite a lot of money towards this problem. And I think you all have realized even that sort of investment only gets you so far down the field, and a lot more needs to be done. So the white paper, for lack of a better term, has highlighted issues around land availability, permitting delays, fees, taxes, and regulations. You've endorsed some ideas that are percolating in the legislature, but you've also talked about the fact that we need 1 million more housing units by 2040. More than half of those are going to have to be lower income, available to lower income Washingtonians. So the problem is large. The timeline is short. You've tried to make a dent in it and realize that's hard to do. What can we do from a policy standpoint? Where does the private sector and the public sector come together to get these units built?
Well, the first thing I would do is say start at the top level and then think about some of the pieces. We need more housing. That's the only way we'll have housing that is more affordable.
You've said 55,000 units a year.
Exactly. So every year we can look at the end of the year. Any year where we had more than 55,000, the problem got better. Every year we're less than 55,000, the problem got worse. Every year the problem's been getting worse. And 2025 in particular looks like it'll probably end up where we probably won't even say top 35,000, especially in permits. So we need to do better. The second thing that we learned, I think, at Microsoft and Amazon is money like ours or money that a city or a county or state can put in can help, but it's just never going to be enough. I mean, Microsoft and Amazon together have spent $1.6 billion. Amazon even more than Microsoft. They deserve huge credit. That has either preserved or built 26,000 units. We are proud of that. That's a good thing. But then so much more is needed. So what do? Well, frankly, we just have to energize more private capital, because unless the market moves to fill this hole, the public sector and others will never be able to do enough. So how do we do that? We make more land available so that developers can have some more land to work with. That's really a key issue in this legislature, this session. We accelerate permitting reform, because permitting, when it comes to permitting, time is money. We try to reduce some of the costs that are keeping developers from building especially middle or lower income housing. We use technology, and we bring all of our resources to bear. And then I think the other thing, and I think it's something that it's easy to forget, developers and especially investors, even if they only want to invest in the United States, they have 50 states from which to choose. It's really important for us to send the message, we value you. We want your money here. We want to work with you. Microsoft and Amazon together did that. And part of what we've heard is that energized more developers to come here. I think as a state government, as leaders, as business leaders, as nonprofit leaders, this is a year to send out a clarion call. We want to build more housing. We want to work with people who want to come to Washington State to help build the housing we need.
Help me understand what Microsoft's interest here. And I will say this not flippantly, but people who work at Microsoft tend to make pretty good money. They might be able to afford houses. Why? What is the interest here that the company has in this problem?
Well, you can think about it at 3 levels in a very direct way. First, hey, look, we have people right out of college. Not everybody can afford to go buy a condo or a house, even if it's closer to within their reach. So that matters to one.
So you're thinking about your own workforce to some extent?
That's one thing. Yeah. The second is every day. Whether it's the people who are cleaning our offices, who are serving our folks food at the cafeterias, driving our shuttle buses, they are not in the same position, and we rank those folks among our friends. So they're part of our workforce, even if they're not always a direct Microsoft employee. But number 3, and this is the thing that matters most in my view, you can't have a healthy company unless you are in a healthy community. And we should recognize, like if you're in Bellevue or Redmond today, if you're a police officer in Bellevue, you can't afford to buy a home in Bellevue. If you're a nurse, if you're a school teacher, if you're a firefighter, none of these folks actually get to live and work in the same community. And what's true in Bellevue is actually true across an increasing number of communities across this state. We need to change that. We need to change it first and foremost for all the people who are not getting access to, I'll just say, the housing and their housing dreams. It used to be just like when this decade began in Puget Sound, People were buying a home, say their first home at the age of 32. Now it's the age of 40.
Yeah.
That's a terrible change. So we need to solve this problem for them, but we actually need to solve it for all of us, because we need to live in a community where we all get to live together.
One of the things I hear is that, yeah, private investment is a part of the solution, but especially for that lowest income housing, it's going to be the public sector, because they're the ones who will build it. It just doesn't pencil out for the developers. And so that's one. And then the other is just, again, the scale isn't meeting the moment. And so I'm wondering, as you think about, and especially from a private sector perspective, what it would take, what does the Marshall Plan look like to get the housing we need? And what is the mix of public versus private?
I can't give you the exact percent, but you're definitely asking the right question. And, it's why when David Sapolsky at Amazon and I co-authored an op-ed a couple of weeks ago, the first thing we endorsed was the governor's proposal to add more than $200 million to the Housing Trust Fund. We do need more public money, but we should actually target it where private money is least likely to go. And I think you just hit the nail on the head. Look at the lowest income housing that money won't reach. But then I actually think the Marshall Plan in this case is much more of a all hands on deck. Let's bring down the cost of housing for the developers who would build, say, lower or middle income housing. Let's take land like strip malls, that in some cases now are mostly sitting vacant, and rezone that so it can be used for either commercial or retail or multi-use families. Let's look around our transit centers. And we might want retail on the ground floor, but let's build residential housing above that. Let's really change the way permitting works. And I would just say, we see this around the world. At Microsoft, we have more than 800 permitting applications in more than 40 countries. Permitting is a problem everywhere, but we can use technology. We're doing this as a company in British Columbia to make that go faster. It won't be one thing, but it's a number of things by everybody. We won't solve it in 1 year, but we can make a difference in the second half of this decade. And let's put ourselves on the right side of that curve so we go into the 2030s, say, with where we're digging our way out of the hole rather than digging it deeper every year.
Yeah, it's definitely a hole we've dug ourselves in, that's for sure. Let's talk about data centers, which have become very political around the country in the context of AI and the energy that's going to be needed. Microsoft recently announced a pay our own way approach that talks about not putting the burden on ratepayers to cover the cost, as well as trying to also compensate for the water usage. Tell us a little bit about this approach. When I read it, I thought, well, is this what all your competitors are doing? Are you doing something that's putting you at a disadvantage? I mean, Meta got tax breaks to go build a giant data center in Louisiana. That's usually what we expect to see. Who will give us some money to do this? But I want to understand what's motivating this approach and kind of where it puts you in terms of your competitors.
I think the industry is moving in the right direction. We may have helped to accelerate some of that movement with what we are doing. Obviously, the investment is massive. Call it $130, $140 billion of capital expense by Microsoft this year alone. And we will have data centers in 20 communities in 10 states. So it's across the country. It's always about local communities. We can look to Washington to do more, and Washington is doing some more, Washington, D.C., but the reality is it's the county typically that sets the zoning, and it is a municipality or county that does the permitting. Mm-hmm. As we studied the issue, there's 5 big things that people are caring about now: electricity, water, jobs, taxes, and skilling. And we just have to take the high road, be responsible. I mean, what we said is we will pay our own way so that our data center does not increase the cost of electricity for the region or for the neighbors. We'll replenish more water than we consume. I just think it's incumbent upon us to make the presence of a local data center positive for the community. If we don't, why on earth would a community want a new data center to be built? And the one other thing I'll say is, interestingly, the experience in Quincy and Grant County here in Washington State is, I think, very compelling. It was one of the first parts of the country to really see data center construction. It's where Microsoft first started to build its first data center in 2008. You see in Quincy, Washington, something that you almost never see in America. The poverty rate has fallen from 29% to 13%. The property tax revenue has tripled, and it is because of this new part of the economy. They've added to the public high school. I think it's one of the nicest public high schools in Washington State. At a time when rural communities are closing medical centers, they've built a new one. So we've learned a lot from places where I would say this has gone really pretty well to even better than pretty well. We need to stand up for that way of doing business, first across the country and really around the world.
Where does this leave the state has had a tax break for data centers that, whenever it's up for expiration, the business community is asking for it to be extended. Are you saying that Microsoft would say no to those tax breaks in the future as part of this new approach, or would you still be accepting those? Help us understand the nuance here.
I think there's two or three things to think about. First, to me, the most important taxes are the local taxes, the property taxes. This is, a data center, in Quincy is a small thing for Washington State, and it's a huge thing for Quincy, Washington. Yeah. So, what we're saying is we're not going to ask for any property tax breaks in these local communities, and we're just basically going to become, as we typically do, the largest taxpayer in each county, and the public will decide how to spend that money. States are taking different approaches, and they have taken different approaches over time. I think Washington State was smart years ago when it said we want to incentivize this with typically a reduction in the sales taxes on, say, construction or new computers. There's not anything due to expire imminently in Washington State, but there is legislation this session that would cut back on the relief on sales taxes on, say, the replacement of computers. We're following that. We're thinking about that. Frankly, we're trying to think about it not just in terms of what it means for Microsoft, but what it means for the whole data center ecosystem. And, we'll see. That'll be one of the many issues that gets thrashed out here in Olympia by the end of February.
There is also a data center bill that's being considered. Yeah. And is that something that Microsoft has endorsed at this?
We haven't endorsed it. We've said we share the intent. And
the intent is very related to what you've been saying, which is trying to protect local communities and ratepayers from the impact.
Let's be responsible. Yeah. And so, there's a commitment to transparency, which we feel, I think, generally comfortable with. There are issues around electricity and water. Those issues, especially the electricity issue, tend to get very complex. We'll see if it's possible to sort those out in the next 5 weeks. And there's a lot of complexity. The issue that I personally probably feel the strongest about is ensuring that local money stays in local communities and doesn't get redirected to the state. We, of course, appreciate what the state government does, but fundamentally, I feel that these data centers that we build, including in Grant County and including in Quincy, it's really about a local compact. It's about a relationship with the local community. I feel that we will go to bat, to fight for the local community to keep the benefits of this and not see them sent and dispersed across the state.
On the electricity, one of the criticisms and concerns is where are we going to get the electricity, whether this is in Washington or across the country. Can the grid sustain this? We already in this state have a projected shortfall in sort of our future electricity needs versus what's available. Do you believe we're going to need small module nuclear? Where do you think we're going to get the power for these data centers and for all of our other electrification?
We're going to need a lot of new sources of electricity. It's interesting. Again, I sort of zoom out for a moment. Until 1970, every decade, the United States doubled or more than doubled electricity production. Then we went through 30 years to the end of the 20th century where electricity grew but at a declining rate. And now we've had about 25 years where electricity production has been just about flat, growing maybe 5% in a decade. We've got to get back to growing electricity production across the country by, call it at least 25% every decade. That's a massive change. You don't just flip a switch.
Especially if we're taking fossil fuels
Yeah.
offline.
So you've got to decide where you're going to generate more electricity and how. And you've got to pay for that. And one of the things that we do is we enter into an agreement with the electricity provider, the utility, to off-take the electricity so then they have the investment certainty they can add to the production. We need to improve the grid. We need to improve the transmission lines. You need to put in new substations. And there's a pretty prescribed formula for doing that where, say, as a data center builder, we pay for that addition. But the whole industry needs to basically be transformed. If you go 25 years without growing, and the whole exercise is about maintaining what you have, having financial stability, having rates set by utility commissions, and suddenly go, man, we got to go back into growth stage. It's a lot of different things that need to come together, including on the investment side. And so as a country, and really as a planet, the truth is we're all going through this together, and it's going to require a lot of change, say, over the next 5 years in particular.
Do you have, just before I go to break, a opinion about nuclear?
I think nuclear is part of the present and the future. I mean, we did a huge investment with the utility that runs 3 Mile Island to bring a lot of electricity back there. I think we will see small modular reactors. Someday we'll see fusion. We'll see other forms of nuclear power, and that's a good thing. I believe we can do it economically and safely.
Okay, let's take a quick break. We'll continue our conversation with Microsoft Vice Chair and President Brad Smith when we return. Back after this.
It took a while before both sides realized you're not going anywhere, we're not going anywhere. We need to figure out how we're going to do this together.
The alternative of no agreement and fighting in the courts and all that uncertainty was going to be harmful to everybody. And time was of the essence.
Welcome back to Inside Olympia. Joining me once again is Microsoft Vice Chair and President Brad Smith. And I want to ask you just one other question about data centers. There was the water component piece. You've talked about replenishment. Shortly after that announcement, the New York Times wrote a story saying that the company expected that its annual water needs for roughly 100 data centers complexes worldwide would more than triple this decade to 28 billion liters in 2030. The company, I think, pushed back on that, said it was lower than that, but nonetheless, it looked like on paper that at the same time the company was saying we want to replenish more than we use, that your own internal projections are we're going to be using a lot more.
Yeah,
So just help us reconcile.
Yeah, well, first I would say we did disagree with the New York Times on this, and we pointed out that they were using forecasts that had been overtaken by new forecasts, and we're very focused on bringing down the water use in our data centers. A lot of that is through what we call closed-loop liquid cooling. So you put the liquid in, and then reuse it. So you don't continue to take water out of the ecosystem. In fact, most places the amount of water we take out of the ecosystem once we get running with especially our most modern data centers, is very low. But the key other point is replenish. What does that mean? Yeah. It basically means that we find ways to put more water back into the local ecosystem than we use. And there's two ways we do that. One is we spend money to actually improve the water system. It's fascinating to me. Like we'll calculate in a place like Arizona, how much water are we using? We'll go in, we'll spend our money, and we'll fix leaks in the water pipes that, say, a city has so that they don't lose that water. And so it's like a ledger that gets calculated. In other places, we'll make investments to, say, improve watersheds and conservation. So I feel very confident that we will meet our water goals. We will both reduce the amount of water we're using. We will replenish more water than we are using. But we have to, I think, really push ourselves as we are. We have to be transparent. I think the culture of, say, the data center sector is and needs to change. We have to be more transparent. Water usage is just one of the areas where we need to be more transparent. That makes us accountable. And I believe with that combination, we will do what we need to do.
And of course, the reason we're talking about data centers and all of this data center building that's happening is in large part being driven by AI.
Yeah.
So let's transition to that sort of broader topic, and I would put it under the banner of the business kind of climate, the tech business climate in our state, and then also where we're headed with AI. I'm looking at headlines sitting in front of me right here. Bellevue's T-Mobile lays off 393. Amazon lays off 2,200 more employees. Microsoft has gone through rounds of layoffs. Starbucks has. What do you think the kind of current layoff headlines tell us about the economics of Washington State, sort of more broadly, and more specifically, the durability right now of the tech industry, especially with kind of the AI disruption that's happening?
Well, a few things. I'd start with the fact that we are the most tech-dependent state in the nation. We like to remind ourselves that we're the most trade-dependent. We're even more tech-dependent. 9% of the state's jobs, but more importantly, 22% of the state's payroll depends on the tech sector. And Danny Westneat wrote this past Sunday. We've
had the
had
Seattle Times, yeah.
Yeah, the Seattle Times. Like we had a prosperity bomb go off.
Yep.
And it went off for 30 years. And I would give speeches in like 2010 and say, hey, this is great, but let's remember, 100 years ago, Detroit was the center of innovation and growth. Nothing lasts forever. We've had this wonderful run, and it's brought a lot of prosperity. I do think we're in an interesting time. Let me just use that word to start with, because the tech sector is going through a transformation. Traditionally, tech spent almost all of its money on people. People, a lot of money on people, a small amount of money on computers. Now we have to spend this enormous amount of money on computers, data centers, land, electricity, and the like. So we're all making that transition. That's the first thing. Second, I think there's other aspects that are contributing to the transition. There was a lot of hiring, even through the pandemic. And I think across the tech sector, I think people ended up concluding that maybe they hired more people than they really needed. So you're seeing that work its way through. The other thing that I just think we should remember up in Washington State is, the truth is Silicon Valley is still the epicenter of the tech sector, or really it's Silicon Valley and San Francisco. And then up in, say, Seattle, we've had Microsoft and Amazon, great companies like Zillow, Tableau that got acquired, but really 80 engineering outposts of companies based in Northern California. And I do think that we have a couple of challenges right now as a region. The epicenter of the tech sector has almost re-congregated in San Francisco itself. That's where OpenAI and Anthropic is. They've become a home for more of the AI-centered the startups for AI. And that gravitational pull, is leaving us a little farther from the center, so to speak, than we were before. I also think that when other companies sort of reallocate their spending, it's easier to sort of cut at, call it an appendage. And if you're headquartered in San Francisco or Palo Alto or Mountain View, Puget Sound's an appendage. So we have a set of challenges to navigate through. And I think it's a time where we need to think about how we navigate it. I think it's a really important time to continue to attract venture capital and new startups. And I think it's an important time for us to keep nurturing, say, the University of Washington and others that are producing talent, because I do think one of our longest, most enduring assets is just that ongoing talent that will keep jobs here.
How much do you think, you talked about companies needing to invest in infrastructure and putting dollars there, and your company is putting a lot of money right now into that. But we just had Washington's chief labor economist on speaking about what she's seeing as a softening. The unemployment rate's still pretty low, but in other respects, there are some warning signs on the horizon. And she talked about the potential, sort of the future of automation and what does AI mean for our job climate. I've got kids in high school. I'm thinking about that, and I think most parents are. What are our kids going to encounter when they enter the economy? So what's your assessment or evaluation of that?
Well, I'd offer two thoughts. The first, call it an Olympia thought. Never take your strengths for granted. The tech sector, love it or hate it, is one of this state's economic strengths. Don't take it for granted. Don't do what Los Angeles and Hollywood did with movie production and then wake up only after it's moved to other places. But then second, let's address your question head on. What will the impact of AI be on jobs? I would start with the premise that it will be a technology that has an ongoing and even profound impact on jobs over, say, the next 25 years, the second quarter of the 21st century. It will create new jobs. It already is. It will displace some other jobs, like, say, the number of people who work in a call center providing customer service, for example. It's going to change a huge number of jobs. And frankly, one of the things I find most interesting is how it's changing even, say, the work of a software engineer. It's taking sort of three subspecialties, and as people can use AI to code, it's bringing those specialties together. And now instead of being a coder, you're a builder and in what we call a full stack engineer. And that requires both learning new technical skills, AI-related skills, but also a lot of other skills. I think there's going to be more value in being able to be a generalist and not just a specialist. We're all going to need to adapt. Now, this isn't the first time that's happened. The change from, say, a horse-based economy to a combustion engine and an automobile-based economy was, I will argue, every bit as profound over the course of 30 to 50 years as this will be. I will say this, if one thing is clear above all else, people who can learn, people who can adapt, people who can use AI are going to be a lot better than those who are not and cannot.
What do you think is the time horizon here?
This is a really interesting question because I would first say, you know what, it's like incredibly easy to like sit down with you and offer a grandiose perspective about the time horizon. And it drives me slightly batty when people in the tech sector do that. And I just sat down this weekend using AI, the researcher agent in Microsoft Copilot, and I fed it a bunch of names and said, evaluate how accurate all these tech leaders were.
About their predictions.
About their
past
predictions on timeline in particular. Bill Gates actually was the highest. He was the only one above 50%. Everybody else was in the 20 to 30% accuracy range. So the first thing I would say is, hey, look, let's all be curious. Don't be judgmental, be curious.
And nobody has a crystal ball.
Nobody has a crystal ball. I'm on the side that says this is going to be something that unfolds over the course of 2 to 3 decades, not 2 to 3 years. It doesn't mean that the pace won't accelerate, and it doesn't mean that there won't be, a roller coaster. There won't be times, when, say, displacement gets ahead of job creation. So we need to be ready for some challenging times. But, the people who say, oh my gosh, by 2030, the whole world's going to be different. Usually technology doesn't get adopted that quickly. It may get invented that quickly. But it takes a lot longer for it to be diffused, the term economists use.
What do you think? Again, I'm going to just ask you the question you said would be unwise to answer. But when do you think artificial general intelligence will arrive? What is the timeline for that?
Well, this is what bothers me about that question, because what the definition of the question is: when will a computer get better in doing almost everything than almost everyone?
In my defense, I asked the question because it's sort of been promised as
it's
pretty imminent, and then it kind of gets pushed out.
I'm not giving you a hard time,
I know.
But let me put it this way. If the zenith, the very height of human capability was reached in 2025, and from here on in, we're never going to get any better at anything, then we might get outpaced by computers in the next, 5 or 10 years. But every time technology gets better, it gives us the opportunity to use that technology to get better ourselves. I find it just fascinating myself. I am constantly asking more questions and learning more, and then asking other people more questions and answering more questions. And the truth is, I feel like we're becoming more curious. We're actually learning more, not less. People are becoming better writers, not weaker writers, when they use this well. So I'm not giving up on people. See, that's the biggest mistake I think people in tech make, is not that they underestimate technology. They underestimate people. people get smarter. Thank goodness. We should keep doing that.
Okay, let me kind of ask you the inverse question then. What about all of this talk we're hearing about the potential for an AI bubble, the circular financing that's happening in this industry, the criticisms that ChatGPT, for instance, by the time ChatGPT 5 came out, it wasn't as revolutionary as previous iterations, and that this is just a house of cards waiting to kind of collapse on itself. What's your response or view to those who are saying, and this gets back to that economy question, right? The stock market, what's the percentage now of the S&P that's tech? I mean, we're all kind of relying on this.
The interesting thing is, first of all, I would say, based on all the data we have right now, in the short term, we don't see a bubble. The real challenge is keeping supply so that it can keep pace with demand. And we don't see for ourselves or the rest of the industry even ability for supply to catch up with demand, probably at least until, say, early 2027. So that is the short term. Then you look more on a longer term. You get back to, well, I don't have a crystal ball, but what I do have is a history book. And what one sees is that this is really the 7th wave of major infrastructure in the history of the United States. 6 prior times, 5 of them driven by technology, went from canals to railroads to electricity. We then had telephones, automobiles required highways, airplanes required airports. So you look at these, there's a certain pattern that emerges, especially for private sector funded infrastructure. Things go well until they don't. That's when there's a bubble that bursts. And there's 2 things that can kill you and a 3rd thing that can send you to hell. The 2 things that can kill you is when there's oversupply, usually caused by a recession. Demand grows until a recession hits, and then all of a sudden demand drops. And and what can kill you is the excess capacity and too much debt. So I think the thing to focus on, certainly the thing that we focus on as a company, is keeping our feet on the ground, being very disciplined, thoughtful, even conservative in how we take on debt and how we manage it. So that combination, oversupply, too much debt, that can kill you. You know what can send you to hell? Accounting that was too creative. That's where people really get themselves
And there are
into
people
trouble.
who say the accounting is too creative. And I know, Microsoft stock took a hit last week because there was concern about the obligations to OpenAI that are sort of outstanding.
But believe me, our accounting is not creative. Our innovation is and needs to be. Our products need to be creative. Our accounting, no. That is not the place to be creative. So I would just say, look, at some point between now and the year 2050, will we have a challenging moment? Well, I would be surprised if you don't have a challenging moment every quarter of a century. But I think it's all about being focused, being disciplined, being careful. And then, by the way, the last thing I would say is, you know who the smartest investor often is? The second investor. It's the person who goes in when the first investors made the mistake. They got too creative. They had too much debt. Somebody then goes in and buys an infrastructure project that's 2/3 complete for 1/3 the cost. This is true for a lot of development.
Are you hinting that Microsoft might absorb OpenAI at some point?
Not at all.
Okay.
Not at all. Okay. But I will say that is what history should teach us. And it may not repeat itself, but we're better off to be well informed.
Well, let me bring it back to the public policy conversation. The president has issued an executive order with the intent of trying to dissuade states from regulating AI. Whether that's being successful, I think, is questioned because there's a ton of AI regulation bills being introduced in states across the country, including Washington State. We had an AI task force. Number of ideas emerged from that. Bills are moving along right now. What are your thoughts on the proper role of states in regulating this emerging technology?
Well, I do think there's an important role for states to play. And like most things, you probably won't be surprised to say, hey, we should be thoughtful, we should be balanced. Where do states play their most important role? Well, it's product liability sometimes. It's definitely child safety.
Big theme this year.
Yeah, it's worker safety. These are, it's the role of the state attorneys general. It's protecting against fraud. all of these things, we should not stop the states from doing what they always do, what I might even argue that under the Constitution they have the authority to do. Now, at the same time, then there are other areas that I think are left best at the federal level, especially the kind of, call it, product review that takes place in order to put a product on the market. You don't want to fragment the country. And we don't, say, for like a pharmaceutical product or something like that. For a new airplane, imagine if Boeing had to go to 50 different states to get an airplane into the air. So, that's common sense. We should, I think, in my view, apply that same approach to AI. And that's where we ought to think about preemption. I'm hopeful that as this conversation evolves, we'll find our way on that kind of path. And I think then when you have the authority to legislate at the state level, as we say do in Washington State, think about what other states are doing. Anytime you can be more similar to the other states rather than different, probably that's a pretty smart thing to do.
Just to be clear about preemption, would you be proposing preemption once there's some federal guardrails in place, and maybe then if there's conflict with state laws, or would you, because there have been efforts to preempt?
Well, interestingly, first of all, look, under the general understanding, the federal government doesn't have executive power. It's the Congress that passes a law, and in that law it preempts the states.
And they haven't done that.
They haven't done that.
So the president did his
and you
executive
preempt
order.
by doing something. So you pass guardrails.
Although the proposal was to preempt for 10 years and then maybe pass guardrails.
Yeah, we did not. Microsoft didn't, support that for all the reasons we're talking about here.
Just in the couple of minutes we have left, and since I have you here, I feel like it'd be remiss not to ask you about the Trump administration and its impacts internationally, nationally on business. There's tariffs, there's general disruption. There's the headlines out of Minnesota because of the crackdown on immigration. You guys are obviously a H-1B visa dependent company, and I think he slapped a $100,000 price tag on those now. How are you evaluating this moment we're in this country and kind of what it means globally?
Well, it's a pretty momentous decade is what I would say, and there's a lot that you put into that question, so let me just unpack it a little bit. And let's look for what's going well, what might cause concern. First, look, I think that steps that are bringing manufacturing back to the United States are not only good, but arguably they're overdue. This administration has pursued some very creative measures that I think have probably surprised most people in terms of accelerating investment into, especially, say, manufacturing in the country. Second, a message I often take to Washington, D.C. is, but we also need to sell overseas. We want the world to use American technology, buy American products, use American AI. And we need to recognize that those kinds of exports depend on trust. When we ask a government, we need a financial institution, a healthcare provider in another country to use our technology, we're saying trust us. And we need to sustain trust, not just with the company and countries, but between countries. And we ask the administration to focus on that, and they hear us out, and they often do things. Third, things like H-1B visas, they affect us directly, and so we've spoken out on those. And so far we've avoided the kinds of impact that people have talked about that I think would have really set high-skilled immigration back. And finally, I do think that as a business community, as a country, we all depend on a sound constitution, on the rule of law. And that's why the Business Roundtable, spoke out almost 2 weeks ago about the issues in Minneapolis. And we support the work of the Business Roundtable just like we support the work of the Washington Roundtable here. I think the business community has an important voice.
Okay. I am going to stop you there because we're out of time. Brad Smith, Vice Chair and President of Microsoft, thank you so much for taking the time.
Thank you.
Appreciate the full hour, and we'll have you back on.
My
Appreciate
pleasure.
it. Thank you for watching Inside Olympia. We'll see you again next week.